Somehow I blinked and suddenly it's October and conference season is upon us. For some schools, conferences already happened. For others, it's a ways away yet. One year, our school decided to have conferences in September, and honestly, I really liked it. It was such a great way to continue to build relationships with families that we had met at back to school night just a few weeks before. And it was also just a great way to get a jump start on providing different supports that students needed, having some of those really important conversations, and also discussing some concerns that had already been brought up within the first couple weeks of school. However, whether your conferences already happened or they aren't happening for a few weeks yet, I still just want to encourage you to catch today's episode. I have a feeling you might catch at least one thing that you maybe haven't thought about before. Before we get into today's episode, there is one thing I do want to quickly address that can often be misconstrued. As teachers, we want to be as inclusive as possible. So sometimes we say parents, sometimes we say families, sometimes we say guardians, sometimes we say grown-ups. Whatever makes up your student's caregiver, please know that if I mention family or if I mention parents, I am referring to their primary caregiver, the one who is taking care of them. Sometimes we have students who are being taken care of by grandma or grandpa that they refer to as mom or dad. Sometimes we have students who are being cared for by an aunt and uncle, or they're possibly in foster care, or they have a family friend who is watching over them while other things are going on. Our students all have very different family dynamics, so we just want to be sure that we are being inclusive of all of those. So if I say family or if I say parents today, I am referring to the grown-up that is the primary caregiver for your student. And with that, let's get into today's episode.
Welcome to the North Dakota Teaching Podcast. Whether you're a first-year teacher, veteran teacher, or just a mom trying to gain some new insights, you are right where you are meant to be. Kayla Durkin, founder of the Blossoming Teacher course, is passionate about helping new teachers blossom into the teacher they were born to be. Kayla wants to help inspire teachers to be their best self, whether that means sharing about personal or professional development, self-care, or the latest and most effective teaching strategies. Through this podcast, you will hear from real teachers sharing their stories about teaching, all with one main goal in mind: to be able to make an impact and help other teachers blossom. And with that, here is your host, Kayla Durkin.
Hey friends, welcome back to the Let's Talk Teaching podcast. As you can tell, I still have not got that intro clip changed out yet, but no worries, hopefully it will be happening sooner than later. I know that conferences can be stressful, and I really don't want them to be, especially if you're a first-year teacher or you haven't done conferences in person because you were teaching virtually last year. There are a lot of logistics that we need to figure out, and with that comes the scheduling. In some schools, conferences are just an open house style, which definitely takes some of the pressure off. Whereas in other schools, the secretary might schedule conferences, but also there are schools where the teacher has to schedule the conferences for the families. If you are in a school where you are responsible for scheduling those conferences, I highly recommend using a website such as Sign Up Genius. It doesn't have to be that one, but that website is going to be a great starting point for you. This website is just going to help you send out a schedule where the parent, the guardian, the grown-up is able to select a conference time that works for them. You are going to see it on your end. They will be able to see it on their end. And once that time slot is selected, it no longer appears there. It's no longer available for anyone else to choose. So this is just a really good website that is going to help you if you have to schedule out those conferences. But with that, please remember that not all families have access to technology, so you might have to make a few special arrangements. Whether you are scheduling these conferences or the secretary is scheduling them for you, tip number 1 is all about sending home reminders. Have your students write their time in the planners. Send it home on a piece of paper. If you are teaching younger grades, you can do the cute bracelets as a reminder. Send home a piece of paper that parents have to sign or initial saying that they remember that their conference time is coming up. Not only is it important to communicate when these conferences are happening, but it's also really important that each of the families know when their specific selected time for the conference is happening. That way they show up during their exact time. On those notes, you might ask them to come a few minutes ahead of time because typically with conferences, our conferences are scheduled back to back. You have a very limited amount of time that you get to spend with each of the families, so you really want to be sure that you can use all of the minutes as wisely as possible. Tip number 2 probably should have been before tip number 1, but do not wait until conferences to express any struggles that may be happening in the classroom, whether it's academically or behaviorally. Our students, grown-ups, really do not want to be caught off guard, especially if it's a behavior problem. They want to know what's going on. That way, when they come to the conference, you have protected time that you can talk about some of the things that you've maybe already communicated about on the phone or over email. That way you can use your time to problem solve and find solutions instead of bringing it up and putting them on the spot. Tip number 3 is all about having everything prepped and prepared and ready to go. Whether you're doing student-led conferences or parent-teacher conferences, there are still a few things that you are going to want to have ready. Some of these things include a sign-in form so that you can get a count of whoever is attending the conference, whether it's a parent, a guardian, whoever it is. Have a sign-in sheet so you know who is there. You might want a schedule that's pre-made, pre-printed that you tape to your classroom window or to the door so that if families are out circulating in the hallway, they can walk up to your classroom and see what time their conference is scheduled for. You might have a cute little display in the hallway in the waiting area, maybe some books that families can look at, especially if you're teaching younger grades. You might have an event coming up where you need volunteers. Maybe you have a volunteer form you want to set out or a classroom wish list form that you want to set out. These are all things that you are going to want to have prepared before the night of conferences or the day. Sometimes conferences happen during the day too, but that way you're not doing them at the very last minute. Sometimes there are surveys you're going to want families to fill out. You might want them to fill out a form all about your students, some tips and tricks that are going to help you work with those students in the classroom. Whatever you are going to be using at conferences, just make sure you get all of those things prepped ahead of time so that you're not stressing at the last minute trying to get it all ready to go. For me personally, I like to get everything printed, filled out, all laid out. I paperclip it together. I have always been in a school where we have conferences after the school day. So we teach all day long and then we have conferences into the evening. Those become very, very long days that can kind of get exhausting. So I like to have everything prepped, printed, ready to go. They're all sectioned off. That way, when it's time for conferences, I can just clean up my classroom a little bit. Well, who am I kidding? I can have the students clean up the classroom a little bit, lay everything out, and then we are good to go. Tip number 4 goes right along with tip number 3 because it's something that you have to prep and get ready ahead of time. But I always want parents to leave the conference feeling proud of their child and having something that they can kind of display. And so I like to use what's called 2 hearts and a wish, or you can use 2 glows and a grow. And this is just an opportunity for you to recognize some things that your students are doing really, really well, but then also provide just a little bit of an area of where students can do better. Now, I do want you to know, as you're prepping these, especially if you have a ton of students, you are going to get to students that they're maybe just a little bit more of a handful and they're not as easy to write 2 hearts or 2 glows for. Set those aside and come back to them when you can, but you should be able to pull out 2 really good things about all of your students. And then when you're writing out that wish, it can be an academic wish, it can be a behavioral wish, it can be a social emotional wish. Honestly, it can be anything from helping a student step into their confidence a little bit more, helping students stay on task during class time, getting to class on time, really anything. And honestly, you are going to have some students that it's really hard to come up with a wish or a grow for as well, because those are the students that they're already doing their job. They're already doing what they're supposed to be doing. But with those students, you still need to come up with a wish as well, because not every student is perfect, although we would like to think they are. If you're looking for any templates on 2 hearts and a wish or a glow and a grow, please feel free to head to my TPT store. You can grab some examples there. Now, tip number 5 is one that maybe you haven't necessarily heard before unless you've either listened to all of my podcasts or you've been in the course, because I've talked about this in the Blossoming Teacher course as well. But with these parents, families, guardians, grown-ups, we need to be sure that we are putting on our glove before our conference. Now, when I say put on our glove, that means you're protecting you, but you're also protecting them. As a doctor, doctors put on gloves before they get to work, not only to protect us, but also to protect themselves. So I want you to put on your glove before you go into conferences, because when we're having conversations, we have to remember that some parents had a really bad experience while they were going through school. They maybe don't have the best view for teachers. They maybe haven't had the best experiences in school with teachers. So please put on your glove. Remember that parents are going to have different views. What they believe should be happening for their students might be completely different than what you believe in. And that just gives us the opportunity to stop and to listen. Giving parents the opportunity to talk during conferences is going to help you relate to them so much more, but it's also going to help you problem solve and find solutions if it has to do with something that maybe has been a stress or a struggle in the classroom. And then tip number 6, when all else fails, treats always help. I always try to set out just a little dish of candy or just a little something that parents and students and families can grab as they are coming in, not because I have to, but because it kind of breaks some of that tension. I mean, it's crazy to think, but when you set out a little bowl of Tootsie Rolls or a lollipop or whatever it is, that breaks the ice for a lot of families who come to conferences, even if it's just the parent talking to the student, whatever. So when all else fails, set out a few treats. It definitely helps. So now let's get into talking about student-led conferences and parent-teacher conferences. Personally, I've done both. I have had open house style. I have had where parents come at a very limited time. I've had where just the parents come and students really aren't encouraged to come. But I've also had full-blown student-led conferences. And with that, I have had student-led conferences where the school I was working for had such an amazing plan. The execution was amazing. It went really, really well. But I've also had student-led conferences where there wasn't a huge emphasis on the conferences. It truly wasn't student-led, although the school was trying to get it to be student-led. So I've had experiences with both. So first things first, let's talk about parent-teacher conferences. It's traditional. Let's get it out of the way. With parent-teacher conferences, it's important to first of all know who is invited. Are only the parents invited? Can only one parent come? Can students come as well? It's really important to figure out who is allowed to be there. With parent-teacher conferences, they are typically teacher-led. We typically do not have a ton of time, so stick to a tight schedule when possible. Have a set amount of items that you want to go through. With parent-teacher conferences, I mean, honestly, even with student-led conferences, I like to have just a little folder. I use the large pieces of construction paper, fold them in half, make them into a little folder for each of the students. And inside there, I put all of the important pieces of paper, such as their grades, their test scores, some of the goals that they're working towards, some student work examples, really anything that gives us something to talk about. It's productive. It keeps us on schedule. And then, of course, we want to put our 2 hearts and a wish or our 2 glows and a grow inside of those folders as well. Going through these folders makes it really easy to stay on task. When hosting parent-teacher conferences, I really do want the parents' voices to be heard. So although I have this folder filled with items that I plan on going through, I always like to open up the conference by saying, I have this folder here. There's some important information that we'll go through tonight. But before we do any of that, I just want to open up the floor and just ask if there's anything you want to talk about first. Now, with the parents that I have really good relationships with, this usually goes so well. However, there are some grown-ups that it's maybe not the best question to ask if you do not want to open a can of worms. So if you are hosting parent-teacher conferences and you know that there is a specific family that is going to come in and dominate that conference, I guess is the best way I can put it, maybe don't start out by asking them. I mean, you want to get their opinion, you want to hear what they have to say, but definitely tailor the conference in a way that's going to be productive, not just a time for them to complain. Now, student-led conferences, I absolutely love student-led conferences, especially when it is truly student-focused. So a couple of the questions that we have when we're thinking about student-led conferences, well, first of all, how do we make sure the student actually shows up for the conference? I want to address this first. One of the schools that I worked for, we really worked hard on this. The first time we tried, there wasn't a lot of accountability. Students weren't required to come. We were trying to figure out, well, what can we do differently? What can we do so that the students do have to come to these conferences, but not only that, the students are proud of what they're sharing in the conference. So we were a standards-based school, and we actually decided to use the speaking and listening standards and grade students on their conference. Now, I know right off the bat, this might sound a little harsh, but it actually was so cool. So for starters, we had a rubric, a very specific rubric, and the students were all given this rubric. There was a rubric for elementary. There was also a rubric for high school. That way it was tiered towards the level of learning for each of our groups of students. But on that rubric, it was very specific. It stated what each presentation should have, what the students needed to include in their presentation, but then each of those speaking and listening skills as well. So we gave the students a ton of class time to work on this. We had a couple of times where they would work on it during home base. We also, of course, with elementary, they can work on it whenever in the classroom. But for our middle and high school, we had very specific times where maybe they worked on it during home base, or we had 20 minutes at the end of the day where the whole entire school was working on it. We just found times to provide students the opportunity to work on their student-led conference presentations. That way it didn't fall on them as something extra they had to do outside of school. Now, with that rubric, when they came in to present their student-led conference during their assigned time, something that was really cool was that whatever grown-up came with them, the parent, the grandma, the aunt, the uncle, whoever it was, the student would present their conference, and then the student and that guardian were given the rubric, and they would go through together, and they would grade that student on the student-led conference. I did not receive any bad feedback about that. I think honestly, it gave a lot of ownership to the students to want to do well during their presentations, and they knew that was happening. They knew that's how they were going to get graded, but also it involved the families as well, which was really, really cool to see. With student-led conferences, oftentimes teachers don't really know where to start. They don't know if it should be a certain PowerPoint they do, or a poster board, or a pamphlet. But honestly, maybe you give the students the choice. Maybe you give them the opportunity to choose. That way they do have more ownership. If not, if you want them to just do a pamphlet or a poster board or a PowerPoint, please still just give them some choice in what they are putting in there. For us, our students were still allowed to have memes and different pictures. We encouraged pictures on each of the slides because it helped us get to know them a little bit more. They included pictures of their classmates, pictures of things that they were involved in. And so it really showed us what students were interested in, what was important to them, and what they were passionate about. In addition to the rubric, we also gave the students a very specific handout of what all needed to be included inside their presentation, no matter how they were presenting it. So for starters, the type of presentation is appropriate for the topic and audience. Information is presented in a logical sequence. Students used all given time to complete the portfolio. The student respectfully asked for help when needed. So then we listed the dates there of each of the work times that they had. For materials, they had to have their goals sheet, which included plans for after high school. They needed to include a self-reflection. They did need to include comments from each of their teachers. Again, this kind of goes back to those 2 hearts and a wish. So yes, we had over 100 students that we were working with. And yes, we wrote comments for each of those students. Super important. We used NWA in our state. So we had their data that they had to put in there. Their report cards were really important. Scholarship requirements. All of that stuff was being put into their presentation, and they were talking about it because then they have ownership over those scholarships. They have ownership over their test scores. They have ownership over those comments that their teacher shared about them. There were a couple other things in addition to that, but as for the actual presentation itself, the introduction is attention-getting and establishes a framework for the rest of the presentation. Technical terms are well defined and language is appropriate. Presentation contains accurate information. Materials included are relevant to the overall message and purpose. So all of these things really just come together to support the presentation that our students were creating. Typically, a lot of the students, so that they presented it in a sequential order, they started out by going through each of their classes. So they would just go through their typical schedule. Then they would get into some of that scholarship information, their goal sheets, all of that good stuff. It really was cool, and I don't want you to feel like you have to start from the ground up. There are PowerPoint templates that you can find on Teachers Pay Teachers. I don't have any in my Teachers Pay Teachers store because my students completely designed theirs from scratch. Head on over to Teachers Pay Teachers, type in student-led conference templates, and you will be able to find a ton of examples. They really are a great starting place if you are not sure where to begin. When you're doing student-led conferences, I do want to remind you, yes, your students are coming in and presenting, and their presentations are, hopefully most of them are going to be amazing. Some aren't going to be as good as we hope, but that's with everything in life. But just know that even though they are presenting, this is still the opportunity for you to talk to their grown-up as well, for you to share things that they're doing really, really well. If you do have concerns, to share those things at that time too. Even though your students are leading the conference, please make sure you take the time to hear out the parents' concerns, hear out what they would like to share about as well. That way everyone is on the same page when the conference ends. Yes, your time is going to be limited. For us, we kept our students' presentations between 8 to 10 minutes. Some, of course, did not get near 8 minutes. Some went way over those 8 minutes. Our conferences were a 20-minute block, so we had those 8 to 10 minutes that they were presenting. We had a few minutes to hear about what the parent wanted to talk about, and then, of course, we ended with just a few things that we wanted to follow up with as well. So hopefully today, after today's episode, you have a little bit better idea of how you could possibly use student-led conferences going forward. Whether you're doing student-led conferences, parent-teacher conferences, remember to put on your glove, stay organized, send home those reminders, have a sign-in sheet so you know who is attending. These are all so important, whether you're doing those student-led conferences or teacher-led conferences. And with that, I just want to remind you to smile, stay positive. Remember, you have absolutely got this. If you have any questions at all, reach out, send me a DM on Instagram. I'd love to chat and help you feel a little bit more prepared. But just remember, you are a highly educated individual. I have no doubt that you are capable of handling this. So let me know if you need anything, and if not, I will see you next time.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the North Dakota Teaching Podcast. If you're enjoying the show, please feel free to rate, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. We really appreciate that effort. Be sure to tune in to the next episode for more teaching tips to make an impact. Until next time.